Today we're just going to be talking about automating your workflow with Python. We're going to talk about kind of a high level. We're going to start going with well, I guess I can go to the next one. Kind of a high level of things like just an intro to automation, kind of what you think about when you're developing automated processes, different tools that exist to kind of help you along. Because there's a lot of stuff that I think some people do when they're trying to develop things, especially like with Python or anything in general. That they'll try to build from scratch when they don't realize there's a lot of tools that already exist that can help make a lot of this easier. And then we're going to kind of do an example. I've gone down to one example. I was going to do like two, but it's going to basically be automating scraping from Google Sheets. So that's going to kind of be the flow of things. And also thank you to everyone who who's joining. I know we were going to originally have something on use different things like decrease costs or increase revenue. But I've just definitely taken on a little more than I can chew with trying to do one webinar a week. So I'm probably going to switch this eventually to one webinar a month, just because planning a webinar actually takes a lot more time than I always expect. All right, so let's kind of go into this. So where do we kind of get started? I think XKCD has two great kind of visuals on this, and if you're a technical person, XKCD is a lot of fun. I think they conceptualize a lot in one picture. So these are kind of two different concepts that we deal with in automation. One, we deal with a theory that, if we have a certain amount of work in theory, if we build automation, it should make things easier. But there's definitely this concept where, as you kind of build things, sometimes you build something that is more complex of a system than your original work was in the first place. I often think of code sometimes ending up very much like Rube Goldberg machines, where it's like to do a very simple task that you thought, you could automate, you end up developing a very complex process that then requires a lot of time and thought and maintenance. And that's like the other side of it, and that's why I often find that a lot of things that are automated will often get replaced over time. I've worked at a lot of companies where, some engineer will develop an automated thing, but then once that engineer leaves, that automated thing kind of dies away. Usually this is just because, people, don't know how to maintain it, or like maybe the person that was maintaining it was just coming in every so often and tinkering with it just so it would keep running. And really they might have actually been spending more time keeping it running than actually doing the work. And I've actually done that even in consulting where, I've definitely put a lot of work into helping automate systems and later realized that truthfully, maybe they didn't need to be automated because of how much work we were really replacing. And so there's this fine balance in automation where it's like tempting to automate everything, but sometimes, truth be told, automation might not be what is needed, or it might not be best. Maybe you need to improve the process before automating it. So I always think about these things when you try developing automated systems is like, okay, how often are we running this? Which is kind of more in the second comic. How often are we running this? And also how much time is it going to actually shave off? There's some things that make a lot of sense to automate because, you're doing this every day or 100 times a day and it's really small tasks and they're really boring, really error prone. And then that makes sense to automate. Or maybe it's just super easy to automate, or maybe you can develop a system that's very abstract and can handle like 100 problems that are all very similar. So you should automate it because, again, if there are a bunch of similar problems, even if they're all individual, it's just easy to do that. So these two comics, I think, just kind of give a good idea and encapsulate a lot just of things you should think about before you automate. Because I think automation sounds really cool until you start doing it and until you start having to implement it and you realize it's a lot of work. And it's still code. And I think one of those things that people make a mistake about is they don't realize how much work code actually is. Even a simple script can often take, who knows how much extra time out. Next, so when you're kind of building automated systems, I kind of have some general concepts you need to consider, like building, or at least some pieces that you may or may not know you'll end up needing. So as you build automated systems, especially as they get more and more complex, one thing you'll end up needing undoubtedly is some sort of metadatabase that keeps track of all of the stuff that is running underneath your system. You know, you're going to end up creating jobs. You know, we call them jobs or tasks that run at specific times, and some of them will run, and you might need them to run in a certain sequence. Um, and that's where things kind of get more messy and hairy. You know, then you end up having to develop something that manages the order of all your automated systems. You know, task A goes before task B. Task B relies on, you know, or task C relies on task B and B1, and it gets really complex and hairy. And so you'll undoubtedly end up developing some sort of meta database if you try developing this from scratch. Next is a scheduler. So how often you run a task is variable. Some tasks run every day, and you know, you can just set it up to run at 12 o'clock at night every day. That's probably the most common I'll see is, you know, most people will just say, hey, at midnight, run this task. And that's probably the most common thing you'll see. And so you'll need something that's a scheduler, because sometimes you might want something to run every Monday. Sometimes you want it to run every Tuesday at 8 in the morning. Sometimes you want it just to run, you know, once a month, whatever it might be. You need something that keeps track of how often you're running a system. So one system, or you need something to keep track of when things should run in what order, and then you need something to tell when in general in time that thing needs to run. Again, two very different concepts. And then finally, some sort of dashboard. This one's definitely more of a nice to have, but definitely when it comes to managing hundreds and thousands of automated jobs, it's not just a nice to have, it's pretty much a necessity. The dashboard will just basically take log information. So, you know, you're running all these automated jobs. Another part of all these automated jobs is going to be a bunch of logs that are saying something failed, something succeeded, whatever it might be. So you need somewhere where you've got a dashboard to keep track of all that. Because as things fail or succeed, you want to be able to see, do I need to rerun something? Where are failures happening? Are they happening every day? And having something that can keep track of that is really important, because it will just make your job easier. I think it's one of those things that people don't necessarily think about when you just start developing more and more jobs and tasks, is that eventually when things fail, you're not going to be able to keep track of them fast enough. You're not going to be able to look into what failed fast enough, and things are just going to go wrong and you won't know where. So having some sort of dashboard just allows you to see all that very quickly without having to pour in through every log. The other thing that a lot of people will do is, if they don't have a dashboard, is they might create some sort of notification system. So they might just get emails every time you get a failure. But then what ends up happening is you get 1,000 emails a day for every failure or success or whatever you're tracking. So a dashboard is just a much more concise way of keeping track of all this data. But as you can kind of see, now we're developing a lot of overhead. And I think that's the biggest thing people don't think about, is when you're developing automated systems, is you're developing a lot of overhead. Especially, again, if you're building this for a company, not just for yourself, you're going to want to manage tons and tons of tasks, not just one or two. And is the overhead worth it? And it can be very heavy. And for a long time, you know, companies were forced to build this themselves. I'm going to open up chat. But yeah, so that's generally, I think, one aspect people don't all think of. You know, just building. It's often not worth it just to build one or two automated jobs, because it takes so much extra thought, as well as you need someone that will then take it over when that other engineer, or even if it's not an engineer, it could just be someone that, you know, decided to build some sort of automated thing because they wanted to learn Python or something like that. But when that person leaves and now you suddenly lose the ability to manage this automated job, or someone doesn't necessarily know how it operates, there's a lot of risk there. And so that's why it's typically better to have a whole entire system that automates your jobs. And honestly, at most companies, some of them will use pre-made code, but a lot of big tech companies just will use their own internal systems that they've developed, and it's very standard, and it makes it so they can kind of be decentralized and centralized at the same time. All the developers can write their own code, but they're using the same metadatabase, scheduler, and dashboard, and there's no, you know, although they're all doing their own code themselves, they're all centralized on one system. And that's what makes it very effective, having one central system. All right. So automation options, there's tons of automation options out there, honestly. So Apache Airflow gets thrown around a lot for ETLs, which are data, basically data pipelines. But it really is more of a workflow tool. So it's not just data. You know, if you've got emails that need to get sent out at a specific time, you know, that's something where you could set up with Apache Airflow. It doesn't have to only be ETLs. You could definitely use it to automate just about anything. And we're going to kind of talk about some of the advantages here shortly. Same thing with Luigi. Luigi's another one that's very similar to Airflow. It's got some differences, but it's a Python-based framework that you can kind of use to automate your work. And we'll kind of talk about what it provides here in a second. And then finally, crontab. Now, crontab or cron, they're both kind of in the same boat where if you've used them before, you really just basically, I didn't get a picture of this and I should have, but you basically just set how often you want to run it and the file that you want to run at that time. And so it's very primitive. You can't really do much more than that. You can't really say this file depends on that file. It's very much like run a task at some time. There's another similar thing with like Windows job scheduler. But yeah, so, and even if they were to allow you to do a lot of the dependency management, I think it would be very messy. So let's kind of keep going and talk a little bit about Apache Airflow and Luigi here for a second. So Luigi versus Airflow. So some commonalities between them both. Both have some sort of dashboard that helps you track progress and kind of lets you see what they call the directed acyclic graph, which is just basically each task as it goes forward and what it depends on. So both Luigi and Airflow allow you to create dependencies. So you can say task A runs before task B and B1, and task B1 and B both run before C, and you can create that kind of string of tasks. So you can actually provide that information and you don't have to worry about looking to make sure that something ran before something else, because you know that everything is set up in a way where you can actually reference what should run first. Tasks in both kind of represent a single task of work or a single piece of work. I shouldn't have used tasks twice. So it's more of just like a single piece of work. Typically, for example, in Airflow, you might just say like one task might be to insert data from a CSV to MySQL. And that might be the only thing that happens in that task, right? Like that's a very isolated thing. This allows you to really, know where something went wrong in that node essentially, without having to go back and really figure out what else is going on in that task. So even if some sort of task or job lets you put in multiple things, I generally say do one thing, because doing too many things allows it, or makes it much harder to see where something went wrong. I kind of already talked about the directed graphs concept. So basically they allow you to lay out what should run before what task goes before what other task. So you can create that whole dependency chart. And then both have some form of scheduler. Both really do allow you to set up schedules and how often things run. I think Airflow's is much more straightforward. That's my personal opinion. I think in general, I tend to lean towards Airflow. I don't do too much comparison here in this talk, but overall, when you can kind of compare Luigi versus Airflow, I think Airflow is much more geared towards like really big complex tasks, and Luigi is great when you are maybe just trying to deal with very lightweight automation and you're not dealing with hundreds of thousands, but like thousands of tasks. I think Airflow is much more complex to write sometimes, but I think that's because it can handle a lot more and is a little more robust. And overall, when you compare Airflow to Luigi, Airflow tends to have a bigger community, tends to. I could recheck that, but Airflow tends to be the bigger and more well-supported framework. So if you've got a problem, it's much easier usually to figure out what went wrong in Airflow than Luigi. But both honestly operate very similarly. Let's kind of look at it. So with Luigi, just to kind of give you an idea of what it looks like, and I took this straight from their website, you have basically a class, and that class represents your task. That again, everything's very task-based, and kind of one modular unit of work, whatever it might be that you want to do. And what it'll end up having, or it doesn't have to have all these, but what it could have is something that it requires, which when it's that def requires basically means is what other tasks does it depend on? Is there something else in the past that it's going to need to run before this runs? And then the actual code that's going to run, so whatever that might be, maybe it's just writing to a file, maybe it's scraping data from a website, whatever it might be, that's going to be what goes in that run section. It's just going to be that piece of work. And then if there's an output, you can kind of tell that there's an output, and that output can be used later on for other requires, like, oh, I'm waiting for this output from the, again, in this case, it's called my task. So I'm waiting for the output from my task to finish. Once that's finished, then run the next thing. And so that's kind of the output. And so this is kind of a task basically in Luigi. Again, to me, I think it's very straightforward. It's a little more, what's the word I'm looking for? I do find it a little more customizable in some ways. Airflow has very specific operators, and I'll kind of go over operators here in a second, but it's a little less broad. There are ways you can, write very custom code, but this is just one option. Hold on, I've got a question. Oh, N. I don't know what N means. Okay. Okay, so going back to Airflow, I think Airflow can be a little more verbose in the sense that it does take a lot longer to set up. But I think overall I tend to like it better because it has a lot more support in the sense of tools, which we'll talk about after this one. But basically, the way Airflow works is you kind of have these operators that act as tasks. So if you see at the very bottom of this, oh shoot, I can't scroll in. So if you see at the very bottom, it's got a Python operator, and there's a ton of other operators like bash operators, like various like databases to other database operators that all basically let you say, one, provide some store ID, so that way when you're tracking it and trying to figure out what failed, you know what task failed. In this case, because it's a Python operator, you can actually reference some Python script in the past that you want it to do. You end up setting like what DAG is it part of, and DAG stands for directed acyclic graph. So it's just basically what like bigger project is this all part of. Like there's a bunch of tasks, but what pipeline is that all for? So you can have tons and tons of little tasks in one pipeline, or directed acyclic graph, or DAG. So you can also give it things like if you want it to repeat on failure, which is kind of nice. So like sometimes that some bit of code is likely to fail a lot just because, there's a lot of reasons why something might fail that might have nothing to do with the code being bad. It might just be that something was unavailable when the code tried to run. So you can have it retry a bunch of times. And so there's a lot more things I think you can do and set up from Airflow. So I find it personally more geared towards whatever I need. So that's kind of a one little bit about Airflow. All right, so after that, let's just kind of look at, so Airflow kind of has, I think, one of the nicer dashboards. So this is the Airflow dashboard. When you when you start running Airflow on your, wherever it might be, EC2 instance, Linux box, whatever it might be, you'll end up getting this. Well, actually, when you run the web server, you'll end up getting this, and it basically will show you all your tasks that you can run. And like it'll show you, in this case, everything's actually running okay because everything's green. But failures is one of the boxes, or one of the circles. I always forget which circle, but one of the circles is failures. You'll see it as red. I want to say it's this third circle. Then after the third circle is typically tasks that are blocked by a failure, which will usually be orange. And then you can kind of click, you can't see it here, but you could essentially click through each of these and get logs on the succeeded tasks. And this basically, in the center, you see a number, and that number represents the number of tasks that have succeeded in this case. Gray is if they're like staging to be run. So there's one task that's getting geared to be run. And so, yeah, so it's very like kind of easy to use personally. Because again, this is all made for you. You don't have to build this dashboard at all, and you get all of this insight into what's running, what's not. You can turn off tasks if you don't want them running. You can, and you can really play around with it. So that's one thing that's why I really tend to like Airflow. Luigi has its own version, but I feel like Airflow is a little more intuitive and user-friendly. All your questions right now. All right. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go through just a code example. So I've just to kind of give a flow of what's going on. So we've talked about some uh, just concepts with automation. So more about like why you may or may not want to automate something. We've talked about different tools that already exist that can help you automate a lot of the stuff that you're going to be doing. And now we're going to kind of show you something that you can automate, but we won't necessarily be putting it in Airflow. We're just going to create kind of the code that could eventually, be put into Airflow if you so choose to. I think sometimes doing Airflow code is kind of wonky, so I'm just going to show you kind of writing some code to scrape a Google Sheet. Just because I think oddly enough, there's a lot of times where I have actually had people want to scrape Google Sheets, so we're just going to go over that.